Hello, economic people. Let's go, Handelsblatt. There is life after death. An open letter to Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou from the editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt. It starts with the greatest respect. Always a dodgy start when you start anything with the greatest respect. The Western world is monitoring your efforts to master your country's debt crisis. No other democratic country has ever managed anything like that in peacetime. You are shrinking the state apparatus. You are fighting corruption. You are teaching your fellow countrymen how to become honest taxpayers. And it goes on a bit, and then I pull out this bit. But, and there had to be a but coming. Since then, the spiral has picked up in speed, instead of slowing down. In May 2010, the interest rate at which your country was given money on a 10-year basis was 8%. Today, it is 16%, and in all probability, it will be going up further. The bitter truth to which you and all parties who wanted to help Greece have to admit is that help doesn't help. Your country is getting deeper and deeper into the mess. Debts are growing. The gross national product will decrease by at least 3% in 2011, but it would have to grow by 3% instead if you were to lower your debt to the allowed limit until 2040. This is becoming more and more unrealistic. You can't starve and build up your muscles at the same time. And there's more until we get to financial markets will grind to a halt in horror. This is after the obvious recommendation of this article, which is to default. Financial market will grind to a halt in horror, and then they will turn to embrace the future, because Argentina in 2001, Mexico at the beginning of the 80s, and Germany after the Second World War taught us that there is life after death, at least in the case of highly indebted states. Mr. Papandreou, so far you attempted the impossible. Now you should do the possible. It's getting very, very dodgy out there. Europe is bubbling, absolutely bubbling. It's quite exciting in its own economic way. Eurowatch, Edward Hugh, superstar, not just because he's got a beard. The great Greek and Spanish GDP mystery, one hypothesis from Edward. The problem is the economic figures came out for the EU states. Germany was doing very well, France was doing quite well, and the peripheral countries were doing badly, but not as badly GDP-wise as most people had forecast, and Edward wondered why. But first, a brief intro into Econ 101 Macro. It is important to grasp the fact that GDP isn't the be-all and end-all of economic analysis, and certainly doesn't give us a complete measure of economic activity. Indeed, there are many economic processes which may be of interest to economists, levels of indebtedness, for example, which are simply not captured by the measure, since GDP is what it is, a measure of domestic value added, according to the following formula. Now, a measure of domestic value added is a funny way of putting it, but it is precise in its own way. But the natural GDP is calculated by consumer demand. That's what we talked of yesterday, of retail sales, etc. Investment demand. Investment, we call that normally, not demand, but investment, where a company would, instead of giving share dividends out, would buy a new factory or something like that in the country, plus government spending, plus net trade. That's the difference between imports and exports, be it negative or positive. And that's it. That's all GDP is. So moving on. His hypothesis is, we look at these charts and see Greece goods imports, and we see I love Edward Hugh and what he does, but his charts drive me mad. They always have these, they always start with an up and then finish with a down, and they're most annoying, but still, we can see that blue line on the top graph goes down at the end, and the blue vertical line that goes up is just the thing that annoys me, but it's going down. Imports are going down, and they're doing their best with olive oil and selling it. Exports have gone up, and that is the hypothesis that, as we noted in the Econ 101 macro, what is GDP, the difference balance between imports and exports. Greece cannot now afford the imports. It's getting a few more exports out, but nothing, because it doesn't export things really. But it can't afford the imports that are coming in, so their imports are going down. And it's that import going down that's kept the GDP up. Okay? And a similar sort of thing, but not as marked for Spain. But of course, we've got to understand, as he points out, not everything is grabbed by GDP, although GDP on that basis for Greece is positive. It's going up because imports are coming down. But with imports coming down, the people are obviously being impoverished because those imported things are not there to be had in society anymore. Moving on. Gavin Davis, finishing with Gavin Davis, the UK's supply side headaches. Into the article we get, these changes clearly indicate that the bank is now much more pessimistic about how fast the economy can grow in the years ahead while still hitting its inflation target. It's obviously the Bank of England he's talking about. This must reflect a supply side shock. The Bank of England, we're just like the Fed and other central banks, are in control, we are seemingly finding out. And they are in trouble because some things are out of whack in certain ways that central banks find it very hard to control. So the banks are juggling this inflation and boosting the economy sort of balance. And this must reflect a supply side shock. There are probably two drivers behind this supply side shock. First, the rise in commodity prices reduces the feasible rate of growth of real disposable income. Prices are going up, disposable income coming down. The second supply side factor concerns the underlying rate of increase of productivity in the economy since 2008, and this is rather interesting. The second supply side factor concerns the underlying rate of increase in the productivity in the economy since 2008. In other words, the productivity is going down. And that's because in the build-up to 2008, the crash, bankers were taking a disproportionate amount of money in the economy. No, they were taking it, but they were a disproportionate amount of money in the economy. And a banker can actually, sitting in his little desk, make a huge amount of money, and more than the year before, because it was a financial boom. And these statistics are inexact and spread this out among the whole population. So it looked as though the whole population was being more productive, making more money each individual person, but it was very, very disproportionate. It was the bankers that were making the money, and now the bankers aren't making so much money. Productivity looks a lot worse. If it becomes accepted that the UK's sustainable level of output has been reached by the commodity shock and the shrinkage in the financial sector, this will raise a series of new headaches for UK policymakers. And I'm sorry this is heavy, and you're probably losing the will to live, but my brain is getting to something. So if you pay attention here, when I explain more things in more time, we'll all get it together. The Office of Budget Responsibility has not yet reduced its medium-term growth projections, but if it did, the fiscal arithmetic would suddenly look a lot more problematic. In other words, the government basing on the Office of Budget Responsibility figures have factored in this, this and this. Now the central bank is saying it's going to be this, this, but that the government's going to have to rethink. And what about the bank? The governor may still be hoping that the oil shock will go away. More of this hoping stuff, doesn't seem to be much of a policy, so that he can avoid a bank rate rise this year. In other words, if oil prices go down, inflation might go down, and then without inflation as a bother, he can keep interest rates really low, therefore support the economy during the toughest phase of fiscal tightening, when the budget cuts really start biting at the end of this year and into next year. He will not be able to do this if inflation is permanently above target because of the supply side deterioration. And if anything, I just wanted to read that to you and explain parts of it. In other words, you can read things like this and actually understand it. All you need is, it sounds like gobbledygook at first, but it actually does mostly make sense. Does it? Maybe not. Anyway, if you're troubled and still interested, read it through and see what you can get. And note that on the comments on the Gavin Davis blog on FT that I'm linking here, if you go to the link, very good comments, particularly by Joseph Bell Bruno.